Welcome to another installment of Economics with Tully. This is Tom Simmons, coming to you from my home in Chester, Vermont, having just returned from a trip to Scotland and Ireland. And if you've been watching my videos in order, we've been looking at the policy tools that governments use in order to correct macroeconomic failure, whether it be high prices or high unemployment, or a reduction in GDP, in production. And the two major policy tool sets that we've looked at so far are fiscal policy, which is the notion that government should spend in the economy if the people are not, mostly as designed by John Maynard Keynes. And we've also looked at monetary policy, which is the idea that economies can best be corrected through a professional banking system that controls the supply of money, to increase the supply of money in order to increase spending, or to restrict the supply of money to slow down spending if inflation is taking place. What both of those philosophies have in common is that they operate under the assumption that controlling the amount of demand in an economy by increasing aggregate demand or decreasing it, that's the best way that they can fix a macroeconomic failure. Well, that was pretty much seen as gospel right up until around early 1970s in the United States and in much of the Western world. And then in the 1970s, something new happened that couldn't be explained by a shift or a contraction in aggregate demand. In the 1970s, the United States saw rising unemployment, fewer jobs, less production, and higher prices at the same time. And this is a phenomenon that cannot be explained by shifting a demand curve. If you shift aggregate demand to the right, you get higher prices, but you get more jobs. If demand contracts or shifts to the left, you get fewer jobs, but you also get lower prices. A recession. Well, what was happening were high prices and high unemployment at the same time. Inflation was double digit. Mortgages were at 18%. Unemployment was double digit. This could not be explained through a shift in demand. So what many economists began to look at is, perhaps what we are seeing is a problem not with aggregate demand, but with aggregate supply. And our attention turned to working on the aggregate supply curve as opposed to the demand curve. And this set of policy tools became known as supply-side economics. It is a philosophy, it's an approach that was probably best articulated by a congressman from Buffalo, New York, named Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp had formerly been a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills and was somewhat of an anomaly in American politics in that he was a fairly conservative Republican who continued to win re-election over and over in an urban, ethnic, Democratic district in Buffalo, New York. And Jack Kemp is really the one who put the skin on the frame here of what supply-side economics is all about. Ronald Reagan ran on a supply-side platform in 1980. Obviously, at that time, the economy was one of the biggest issues in the campaign, and then proceeded to implement supply-side policies throughout his presidency in the 80s. George Bush, who followed him, the father, George Bush I, continued them, and frankly, so did Bill Clinton, the Democrat who then followed Bush for the next two terms. So we had this long era of supply-side policies being implemented, directed at the supply curve, not the demand curve. Now, before we look at the tools, let's go back to Eco 101 first couple of weeks. What makes the supply curve shift? Well, when we're looking at a supply of a product or a good or service, we know the supply curve increases when there's an increase in the number of suppliers. We know it increases, supply increases or shifts to the right when costs are lowered. Conversely, if business costs increase, that curve shifts to the left. If the number of suppliers in an industry decreases, that curve shifts to the left. Supply curve shifting to the left produces both higher prices and lower quantities, lower GDP, lower number of jobs. So, supply-siders said, let's shift aggregate supply to the right. If we get the worst of both worlds when supply shifts left, we can get the best of both worlds when supply shifts right. Excuse me. So, there were four main tools that supply-siders suggested, promoted, and implemented during this time between 1980 and the mid to late 2000s. The first was to cut taxes. Now, you've probably heard me discuss that before, because fiscal Keynesians also want to cut taxes. But they cut taxes for consumers because their approach is to put more money in consumers' pockets. The supply-siders said, let's cut taxes for businesses. Let's cut the corporate income tax rate. Because if you reduce cost to businesses, supply shifts to the right. There was controversy over that, there always is, about cutting taxes for corporations. And many people say if you cut the corporate tax, you're going to increase the national debt because you'll have less money coming in to the U.S. Treasury. A supply-side economist named Arthur Laffer counter-argued. He said not necessarily. He said yes, as you increase corporate tax, you'll have more tax money going to the federal government, but only up to a point. And at some point, you come to a place where as you raise corporate income taxes, you're going to take in less money into the federal government. Why? Well, first, because small businesses will go out of business. And a business that is out of business doesn't pay any taxes at all. But secondly, because if a corporation is experiencing high levels of taxation, they'll open up plants and headquarters in other countries with lower tax rates. And they will log their profits there. And basic international agreements, you only pay taxes on profit in one place, not two. So if the American corporate income tax rate is 30% and Ecuador is 15%, it makes sense for your company to open up a headquarters in Ecuador, have your home base in Ecuador, charge your American branches some type of fee, log those profits in Ecuador, and save on taxes. And that's exactly what many businesses were doing. In fact, Citibank is one of the ones that did exactly that in Ecuador. So, supply-siders said lower corporate taxes, and you actually will keep more money, more corporate tax money, in the U.S. They also suggested that taxes overall should be simpler and should be flatter. Meaning instead of having a graduated progressive income tax where the more you make, the higher a percentage of your income you pay, make it flat. Make it 20%, make it 10%, make it 30%. Whatever it is, keep it the same across the board and make it simple and easy. The second tool that supply-siders focused on was infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean transportation networks, communication networks, utility networks. Building roads, building ports, building intermodal transportation hubs, which was a big buzzword in this era, where ferries and train stations and highways and airports all connected seamlessly in one place. Now, people who were fiscal Keynesians like this idea because to them, this is a case of government spending. And government spending is a big tool that fiscal Keynesians will use to jumpstart an economy, because to them it's spending money in the economy. Supply-siders liked it for a whole different reason. To a supply-side economist, you increase the infrastructure because that will make it less expensive, less costly for businesses to move goods and services from one place to another. It decreases business costs. And just as an example, I'm sure many of you watching this might not be aware of what was happening in the 1950s, but prior to the 1950s, there was no interstate highway system. If you wanted to ship goods from New York to Boston, you were on a 2-lane road with traffic lights. You were on US 1. Your truck drivers had to stop and spend a night in a hotel. You probably couldn't do it in one day. In the 1950s, the interstate highway system is built. And now people go from Boston to New York in half a day, in several hours. It made it a lot more efficient for business people, for labor to move from one place to another. And so fiscal Keynesians and supply-side economists actually agreed on something. They got together and they enacted a lot of legislation to expand transportation networks to be able to move goods and services. A third element of supply-side policy was to increase the efficiency of labor. Now, maybe you don't want to be objectified, but the fact is, you are a unit of labor. And if you're a slacker at work, they're paying you for a job and you're not producing much. But if you are efficient at work and you know your job and you do it well, you actually are decreasing the business's costs overall. You're producing more at the same price or at a lower price to that business. So, supply-siders said, let's move away from welfare and towards workfare, which was a process whereby to receive benefits you actually had to work. Many states in this time frame reduced the amount of benefits that people could receive on assistance programs. So they might say you can have public assistance for 2 years. After that, you're cut off in an effort to get them into the labor force. Jobs training programs had somewhat of an explosion in this period. And again, fiscal policy people saw this as a way to spend money in the economy by spending money on training programs. Supply-siders said, hey, let's just give a tax cut to businesses who will train workers in a new skill. So you had job training programs. You also had a total re-examination of the educational system in the United States, which for many years had been focused on public education, where students all went to the same school in a geographic area and learned the same things. States began implementing charter school policies, where students could opt to go to a school that focused on the arts, dance, science, and math, or some other specialty, in order to better equip them for the career that they wanted to focus on. Home education, which had been illegal in the majority of states before this time period, was now legal in all 50 due to both legislation and court decisions, and it took off. You had a re-examination of school choice. And many states began looking at options whereby students would be given vouchers to attend the school of their choice instead of the one that was geographically closest. And the idea here was to incorporate an element of competition between schools for students. And that competition would force schools to up their game, to provide a better education, to provide skills that would equip students for the workforce. Because if they didn't do a good job, the student could choose some other school. In Minnesota, the state government allowed students who had good averages to leave the last year or two of high school and attend community college. And their community college credits would serve as both their final high school year credits and college credits, which cut the time necessary for them to get through school. In New York City, students in Harlem, in Manhattan, were given school choice to attend the elementary school and the high school of their choice rather than the most local one. In Cleveland, the city of Cleveland paid for students in the inner city, who were in districts that were the lowest 1/3 income, paid for them to attend private schools in the exurbs and the suburbs. Instead of that money going to the public schools in Cleveland, it went to the private schools, including parochial schools. So we had a major re-examination of how we educate students, and this is a conversation that continues through looking at things like testing teachers, or asking teachers to be reevaluated every several years, or having students take mandatory tests, or not. This is still with us, and it's been going on since the supply side era changed the standard format of education. The fourth tool that supply-siders suggested was a deregulation of business. And deregulation takes two different forms. The first form is what it sounds like, reducing the amount of regulations on a business. Of course, in the 1970s, when stagflation took hold, we had a whole slew of new laws. A Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, worker safety laws, Food and Drug Administration laws that were enacted during the Nixon administration and earlier. Many businesses really didn't know how to comply, and we're spending a lot of money on lawyers and consultants to teach them how to comply. And so they complained about all of these new regulations. In the trucking industry, many of you are familiar with trucking overnight companies like DHL or Federal Express. The Federal Transportation Agency required these companies at every delivery stop, every single one, to turn off their engine, lock the vehicle, and then do a 20-point check on their vehicle before they took off for their next location. No one did it because the regulation was just too onerous. Food and Drug Administration created regulations for what milk chocolate technically defined was. Now, most of you know what milk chocolate is. You go into a store, you know what it is. But the Food and Drug Administration policy on milk chocolate is 3 single-spaced pages. It just continues to go on and on. That includes percentage of milk fat solids and ratios of this ingredient to that ingredient and the weight of this ingredient to that ingredient. Well, if you're Hershey's or Nestle's, you have in-house legal staff, you have in-house scientists, you buy expensive equipment, you calibrate the machines, and you never think about the regulation again because you got it down pat. But if you're a new business, if you're a small business, if you want to compete against the giant corporations, you have a really hard time complying with this regulation as to what milk chocolate is, even though you may have been making it for years or intuitively know what it is, because you've got to hire a scientist and you've got to hire an attorney, and you may have to buy all new machinery. Made it very hard for small businesses to compete with corporations. So there was an effort during this era to reduce the amount of government red tape and regulation on small businesses. So the second part of deregulation takes a very different form, and that is to eliminate the monopolies that certain large corporations had over the goods or services they were providing. For instance, before supply-side economics, airlines were given monopoly flying rights between certain cities. So for instance, Eastern Airlines, which no longer exists, might have had a monopoly to fly passengers between New York City and Detroit. And the reason behind that was the government wanted to make sure there were enough passengers in one company's flights to guarantee that the company would have a profitable flight from one place to another. Supply-side economists argued that this was simply allowing large corporations to be lazy. They didn't have to innovate. They didn't have to worry about charging high prices to customers. They didn't have to worry about cutting costs. Basically, you were allowing them to get fat and lazy because they had no competition. And so most airlines were deprived of their monopoly rights to fly from one location to another. And as a result, many discount airlines came into being or greatly expanded during this time period, such as Southwest Air, who has become a major player in the American air transportation scene, who was really a very minor player before this. Did some larger carriers go under because they couldn't compete? Yes, they did. But to a supply-sider, that's okay, because competition is good in that it will provide the best service or the best product at the lowest price, as determined by who consumers choose. Another example of deregulation of monopolized industries is the utility industry. And utilities are regulated by the states, so this happened very much on a state-by-state basis, and the experience was different from state to state. If you lived in Maine, in most of the state of Maine, before this time period, you had one choice of an electric utility, and that was Central Maine Power. Central Maine Power owned the power plants that generated the electricity. They owned all the wires and the electric grid that the electricity travels through. And you, as the homeowner or the business, you had one choice, Central Maine Power. And whatever they charged you, that's what you paid. The deregulation of utilities that occurred in Maine went this way. Central Maine Power was told that they could keep their wires, the electric grid, because you don't want 20 different companies erecting 20 different sets of wires throughout a town. It would look like driving through a spider web as you drove through the town. So CMP was allowed to keep their grid system, the wire system. But they were told they had to sell off all of the electric generating power plants. So they were sold at auction. One went to Hydro-Quebec, one went to an investor in Florida. One plant was actually purchased by the workers who worked in the plant, and it became a workers' cooperative. And now the end user, the business, the homeowner, have the right to enter into a contract with whatever power generator worked best for them. So if a power generator said, we will charge the lowest rates for people who use electricity evenly throughout the day. Well, if you're a factory that has 3 shifts and you run 24/7, that's the company you want to go with. If another power generator says, we want to give a cut rate or discount rate to agricultural operations, well, you're a blueberry farmer in Maine, you're going to go with that company. And so the consumer, the end consumer, has the opportunity to contract with the power generator that made the most sense for them. It added an element of competition in the electric industry in an effort to bring prices down and create innovation and allow consumer choice. So, 4 elements. Tax cuts geared towards suppliers. Infrastructure in order to help businesses move goods and services from one place to another more cost effectively. Human capital investment, meaning enabling businesses and schools and educational institutions to work together so that labor, when they got to work, was more productive and more skilled. And then the deregulation of business overall. And for a few decades, this actually eclipsed fiscal Keynesianism as the main go-to set of economic tools that government would go to. Now, in implementing these tools, many of these processes are better done at the state or local level. Education is under state authority, not the federal government in this country. Deregulation of utilities is handled by states, not by the federal government. Very often infrastructure projects, new exits, on-ramps, off-ramps, are decided upon at the local level, at the state level, not the federal level. So many of these policies, rather than being a federal government, a congressional issue, became focused at the local level. And what most states did, in fact, at this point in time, all 50 states, is they began to create something called enterprise zones. Now, these zones go by different names in different states, but in general, we call them enterprise zones. And what they did was they kind of drew lines around economically depressed areas. It might be an area of a city that's particularly economically depressed. It might be a mill town. It might be a rural area that doesn't have a lot of business. They would draw a line and establish this district and say, we will implement supply-side tools within this zone. So if you move your business into this zone or start a business in this zone, we will give you, property tax free for the first 5 years, or we will cut your income tax for the first 10 years, or whatever it is. We will reduce regulations so that you can easily build a new building in this area. Government will provide a new exit on the interstate so people can get off and, to your business or to this district. Or we'll build a parking garage, or we'll increase bus or train service. We will establish a community college in this district. We will establish a jobs training program in this district. This is something that almost every state has to some degree or another. And it's the application of supply-side tools to a very specific, economically depressed area within their state in an effort to jumpstart business. Completely business-focused, which is why we call it supply-side economics. Now, I told you I had just gotten back from Ireland, and Ireland provides another laboratory to look at supply-side tools because they implemented them in the 90s and the 2000s. And the context for this is, prior to the 90s, Ireland was the poorest economy in Western Europe. In fact, its economy was more akin to an Eastern European nation that was just getting out from being under the communist bloc and really didn't even have functioning markets yet. From the 1990s on, Ireland enacted a whole set of these supply-side policy tools. They created business subsidies. They lowered their corporate income tax to 12.5%, one of the lowest in the world. And in fact, when you take into account deductions and other type of write-offs, the effective income tax rate for corporations in Ireland actually was as low as 4%. Now, by doing that, American companies moved to Ireland. They opened up headquarters in Ireland, and they logged their profits in Ireland. After all, if you're a large company and you have a choice of paying 30% tax on your profit in the US, or 4% or 12% in Ireland, where are you going to pay your taxes? You're going to try to log those taxes in Ireland and save millions of dollars. And in fact, Dell, Intel, Microsoft all relocated major headquarters and major bases of operations to Ireland. Their government established something called the Science Foundation of Ireland to train students in biotech and information technology because that's where the jobs were going to be. They improved an entire network of highways from one end of the country to another. They established new light rail service. They extended rail service to the city of Cork. On this recent trip that I took, I was at a store in Glengarriff, Ireland, in the southwest corner, and there was a young lady who waited on us at the register, and she was a little slow, and they apologized. They explained to us that she was at the local high school, and as part of high school, you are trained in a retail job in the local area. It's part of the curriculum. You actually go and work in a store. It's this marriage, if you will, of government through the education network and small businesses. Now, the result of all of these supply side tools in Ireland is that it went from the poorest economy in Western Europe to the fastest growing economy in the continent. And in fact, it was called for many years the Celtic Tiger. And it was called that because the Asian countries that were exploding at the time, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, were called the Asian Tigers. And Ireland was growing at the rate of between 9 and 10% a year, GDP increase. And it was the only country outside of Asia that was growing at that rate on a regular basis throughout the 90s, and then continuing to grow at 6% a year throughout the 2000s. Their GDP per person became the second highest in the entire continent of Europe, having come from a place where they were the poorest country in Western Europe. So we see how the implementation of these tools can jumpstart an economy. Now, my description so far has been all glowing. Everything is not roses. There are criticisms, serious criticisms, of supply side tools. First is the running up of government deficits. Within 3 or 4 years after Ronald Reagan took office in the United States, we had the deepest annual deficits we had had in decades. Now, those were erased by the time Clinton took office. And people will argue as to whether Clinton's policies effectively fixed what Reagan's policies broke, or whether this was a natural phenomenon whereby reducing corporate tax created a big deficit in the government. But over time, as these tools worked out in the economy, it closed the gap or not. And I have no answer for that, and really no one has a definite answer. This is still a political battle. Probably the biggest criticism of supply-side tools is what is often derogatorily called the trickle-down effect. It is the idea that if government helps business, if it lowers costs for business, if it uses tax cuts or tax subsidies for business, that the business will grow and it will help the economy, but it doesn't help every individual the same. You see, under fiscal policy, if everyone gets a check for $600 in the mail, which happened under George W. Bush, everyone considers that fair because everyone got $600. Under supply-side tools, if a business does really well, and if it decides to use that additional profit to reward its employees, those employees do really well. But another business might not do so well, and so their employees get nothing. Or another business may do really well and choose not to reinvest that new wealth in its employees, but instead buy stocks or bonds or some other security to make money. So the effect is not felt evenly across the economy. In recent years, this has become a bigger complaint about supply-side tools because, as we have seen, corporate profits in many quarters increase. We've not seen that translate into increased benefits for workers or increased pay for workers. And so probably the biggest criticism of supply-side tools and tax tools and government efforts that help business is that we all don't see it down here on the ground. It might help those at the top of the corporations, it might help the corporation itself, but not everyone gets the same effect. So that's what we pejoratively call trickle-down economics. Yeah, it may trickle down to us, it may not. Finally, another criticism is that it really is a nice way, a fancy way of engaging in crony capitalism, whereby government decides it's going to help business, but it doesn't help all business the same. Even implementing an enterprise zone means that government is using tax money to help certain businesses in a certain location who will be competing with other businesses in other locations. And it's playing favoritism with one set of businesses or corporations over others who don't get to participate in those aspects of deregulation or those tax breaks. So that's an overview of supply side policy. You now have 3 different sets of tools to look at when you say government should do something. Well, should they use fiscal policy and just spend money in the economy and give tax cuts or increase public assistance to consumers? Fiscal Keynesianism. Should we allow the Federal Reserve to tighten up on credit or to ease up on credit to fix the economy so that people can borrow money and build things and invest that way? Monetary policy. Or should we have government helping small businesses or large businesses so that they can build the economy and a rising tide will hopefully float all boats? Supply side policy. Tom Simmons, signing off with another installment of Economics with Tully.